Hello class, I hope you've had a great weekend. I am just here to provide you with some feedback from our Chapter 2 discussion. So let's just go ahead and get started. The first important topic that we talked about was the least restrictive environment. By the way, please forgive my lack of mad video making skills. I know enough about technology to teach the course. I'm still a work in progress, but I don't have the equipment to make some fancy videos, so we'll have to go with what we have for now. But anyway, back to the topic, least restrictive environment. I could see as the conversation progressed that more people were getting what least restrictive environment is. Okay, there were some cases where I wondered if maybe we were still mistaking the least restrictive environment for the general education setting. Those two are not necessarily one in the same. The point is to make sure that the student with a disability or multiple disabilities in some cases is being educated in a setting as mainstream as possible. The majority of the time, that is the co-teaching setting. Now, some of you may have come out of some classes which were co-taught, but in that case, I mean, that would have been especially if you've only been out of high school within the past 5 years, maybe 10 at the most. It really depends on your district and when they implemented the co-teaching model, but now that is pretty much the norm. So if you were in a co-teaching class, if you had 2 teachers in your course, that means that there were students in that room being served for their disability. You wouldn't have known that though, because that information is confidential. So it's a lot more common than you would think. It's not necessarily a case where you have a student who can't function at that level and they're just tossed in there. I mean, if that happens, there's going to be some people you need to talk to, and you know, we'll get to more of that later. But as far as least restrictive environment, for some students that is general education. They simply need a few accommodations that the general ed teacher can reasonably make. Others, and most actually, need to be in a co-teaching setting. So that's not completely general ed. You have the support of a co-teacher or a paraprofessional in there with you. And then there's others. They need something that's more intense because they have more challenges presented by their disability, and they may need to be in a separate classroom, whether that's for some of the day, like in the case of a resource class, if a student particularly needs special instruction for reading and they go out of their regular classroom for that. Or in the case of self-contained, where the student spends the majority of the day in the same classroom with the one teacher. And those cases, the last two that I spoke of, self-contained and resource, those have become more of the exception than the norm, even though in the past those were the more common modalities of delivering special education services. But we aim to not be so separate anymore unless it's necessary, okay? So keep in mind, special education is a service. It is not a place. So therefore, least restrictive environment, that will vary. And I hope I've been able to clear that up and explain that least restrictive environment is per child. It's decided on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't mean we just throw everyone into regular education. So if I haven't made that clear, if I'm still not explaining it in a way that helps, definitely get in touch with me, because the goal of any course is for you to understand the information, and you can never ask me too many questions. Okay, so you guys gave a range of responses as to how you would feel if you had a student with disabilities in your classroom. All right. Now, I do have to be real with you. You may not have a choice as to whether or not a student with disabilities comes into your classroom. In fact, chances are it won't be up to you at all. Now, this may come in the form of going, say like you're a teacher at a school and you get paired with a special education co-teacher and you're expected to teach classes with this person. And between you and the other person, you are expected to teach all students. Now, of course, in that case, you're going to have that support because that person would be trained specifically in working with students with disabilities, whereas you, as the general education teacher, would be trained in the content area or the grade level, you know, depending on what you're going for. But just know that it's no longer as separate as it used to be. So if you have a student and you don't have the support of a co-teacher or a paraprofessional, or maybe even both, if you do not have that, and if you have honestly made an attempt to meet the student's needs, then you have to speak to somebody. Now, the first person you will talk to is that student's case manager. Their case manager will be a special education teacher. You'll know who's working with that student, you know, at that time. But also, beyond the case manager, you can also speak to the special education department chair in your building. And if you have spoken with both of those individuals and nothing seems to be taking place or no changes have been made, you do always have your school's administration. I mean, it is the law to have the proper accommodations for that student. So sometimes, you know, we get together on an IEP team, have a meeting, and we, with the best of the information that we have, we believe that we have determined a student's least restrictive environment. However, sometimes we're wrong, and we have to have an addendum meeting and update it as soon as possible so that we are delivering the correct services to the student. So, by all means, speak up when these things happen. And in other classes, you'll also learn about Child Find, where you could have a student in regular education, or we'll just say the student does not currently have an IEP, is not currently on any sort of plan, but you notice that the student is having trouble with his or her work. Well, then the RTI process needs to start. So do expect that as part of your job, you're always going to have to be vigilant of how a student is responding. And if they aren't responding favorably, you do have to show that you have taken steps to try to address the issue. Like, you can never just say, oh, well, this isn't going to work, you're going to have to get them out of here. That won't happen. So I just want to be honest with you about that. But it's not as scary as it has to be. It's definitely not a terrible thing. There are some there are some teachers in general education who enjoy working with students with disabilities and enjoy the co-teaching process. And sometimes it's just a matter of getting comfortable with the situation. And right now, most of the class doesn't have any experience in the classroom, so this is a very common concern. And just know that if your intentions are in the right place of helping the child and looking out for the child's best interest, then over time you will get more experience and you will find that it's not so daunting of a task. Now, another issue of great controversy, and I will not be able to give you a right or wrong answer to the question that I posed, but we talked about student discipline and IDEA. Most of you recognize the pros and cons that come with that. The pro being that if a student has issues that pertain directly to his or her disability, then they can't just, toss this kid out of school. Now, let's talk about where this is helpful. Okay, I've seen cases where a student, what comes to mind quickest to me are students with emotional behavior disorder. And if the student has an emotional behavior disorder and is very easily upset, I've seen cases where a teacher might just needle this kid so that the kid then goes off and, well, what do you know? Now we have a reason to write him up or her. So that the law is designed to protect the child from having this happen. Or even if the child does not necessarily display behaviors that's out of the ordinary from any other kid his or her age, even in those cases, if a teacher just simply finds it not preferable to work with a student with disabilities and wants to try to rack up violations on the kid so that they can just transfer him or her out of there, well, that has happened in cases. I used to work in an alternative school, and so I've had very many frivolous cases of students who really, there could have been another way to address the issue other than expelling them and then busing them to another school. Of course, I've also gained many wonderful students in that process, but still, and that happens. And that happened even with the law in place that was designed to protect them. But the point being is that if the student has behaviors which are a direct manifestation of their disability, well, rather than expelling the student, the IEP team is supposed to update the behavior intervention plan and find other ways to address the behavior. And sometimes that does involve a change of placement. For example, a change out of being in a co-teaching setting with a large class with many other kids to a self-contained setting. That has happened before. But you guys were correct in pointing out the cons, and I've seen that happen too. I'm not going to lie. I have seen where students somehow mistook their disability as a reason to be off the hook when it came to behaviors. And I've overheard some of the things that students say at times. Now, please understand, I'm not even nearly talking about all students with disabilities. I'm just talking about a few cases that come to mind where a student has made a comment such as, well, you can't do anything to me because I have an IEP, which is not true. Because if the behavior is not a manifestation of the disability, they are subject to the code of conduct as anybody else. Okay, but there are cases where I have seen where the students or the students' parents have tried to insist it was a disability, and it really was not a part of it at all. So you guys did make a good point. It does happen. Now, here's the thing. I want to encourage you, when, I'm not even going to say if you find yourself in that predicament, when you find that happens. Because if you're going into education, yeah, you're going to come across it at some point. But I do want to encourage you, don't take your frustration with it out on the child. I've seen that happen a lot as well. Remember, you're the adult, you're still working with a kid. Even if the kid happens to be a really big kid, because they can get as old as 21. Actually, 22, but they can get to that age, but you are still the adult, and you still have to work with that child for as long as he or she is assigned to you. And I know, me saying this now, you're probably like, well, duh, Brandy, I know that already. And it's so easy for us to say these things now when we're not inside the classroom or inside the school as to when you actually get there. So I do want to highly encourage that. You will come across cases where you think something's unfair, or you think that a student with disabilities has been given an unfair advantage. That will happen. So just wanted to be real with you. So that was the main part right there. I hope that I have been able to share information with you about these topics, and you guys did a great job. I really enjoyed reading the conversations between you all, and I really appreciate that when you guys do have differences of opinions. So far, everything I have read has been respectful. And once again, if you are going into K through 12 education, or should I say P through 12, because it generally begins at pre-K these days, you will always be in disagreement with somebody. So now's a good time to get used to it. It's okay if you don't agree. It's okay if you don't agree with whatever I say. And, if you have any issue you want to address, I am always open to talking with you about it. So, all right, I've rambled on for about 10 minutes now, but if you have any questions or need any clarity about these topics that we've discussed, just shoot me an email. D2L email is preferred. There's also the Georgia State email that you have. And if you need to get in touch with me immediately, you've got my number. All right, well, you guys have a great week.